Good morning, friends and members of St. John the Evangelist. Welcome to the first session of our four-part study on the book of Job and suffering. During this first session, we'll be looking at some introductory matters. So if you have not ever read the book of Job or have not read it recently, that's fine. You don't need to have read any of Job to participate and listen in on what we're going to be saying today. For those of you who receive communications from St. John's, you will have seen that today's lecture or presentation is titled, God is Not a Vending Machine. I hope that intrigued you all, but I think that this is one of the key things to recognize about the themes of the book of Job. And so in our time together today, I'm going to talk about what some of those themes are and a little bit of historical background and some theories about the composition of Job, when it might have been written, where these things came from, and so on like that. And so for those of you who are at all familiar with Job, you may have noticed or you may remember that Job really has two different kinds of writings. The beginning two chapters and the last two chapters of Job are really a prose narrative, almost a folk tale. And its style is very different than the middle chapters, over 30 middle chapters of Job, which are in high poetic style, the high poetic style of the greatest of the Old Testament prophets, such as Jeremiah and Isaiah, right? And so you have this very noticeable contrast between this very folktale-y frame and this center, which is really a dialogue in speeches, almost monologues really, between Job and then his friends or comforters. And so you have a very different style going on, and you have different issues and different perspectives. So in the folktale-y part of the story, at least at first, we are privy to the heavenly council, where God and other deities and heavenly beings and spiritual entities are gathered. And when we are in the middle section, it's really all Job and his friends hashing this out, and we really don't get a reintroduction of any of the thoughts or ideas or background that we had in those opening two chapters. That doesn't come back until the end. And so it's very much almost like a play within a play. You have this frame, which is the folktale-y kind of frame, which has different characters and different perspective, and then you have Job and his friends basically having their own massive scene in the middle. Okay, and so that is one of the key tensions. Naturally, the folktale section seems to have a somewhat different perspective, or at least is bringing up other possibilities than the possibilities that are brought up in the center poetic dialogues. So you have this tension, not just in style and perspective, but also in what are these texts saying? Now there are tensions even within those portions themselves, and we'll talk about those more as we actually do our studies in those. But this is one of the things that makes Job so challenging. I have often thought that any pastor who thinks that they can adequately preach a sermon on Job in 15 to 25 minutes and capture all that's going on there, is very ambitious because there are not any neat, clear resolutions in Job. When people quote bits from Job to try and use them to support various arguments, I always feel like thinking, are you sure you read the whole book? Because any assertion that you might make from a very small passage or even just a verse or two of Job is probably, if not undermined, at least called into question in some other part of the book in a way that makes it really unclear that you can say, well, this is the message of Job. So one very famous Old Testament scholar, James Crenshaw, has said, tensions exist between the prose and the poetry, and even within each literary form. The story's patient hero in the beginning, and the defiant Job of the dialogues. A divinely commended hero in the prose at the beginning, the folktale, and a rebuked one in the poetry when God returns at the end to address Job. The divine name Yahweh is used in the folktale, but in the poetry, God is called by the names El, Eloah, and Shaddai. And you have this happy ending in spite of the argument that the hero, that God does not need to deal with humans on the basis of merit. You have characters that appear and disappear. And all of this means that there are these tensions. And Crenshaw says, although skilled authors can use dissonance effectively, the book is at odds with itself, and irony abounds. So this is a challenging book. For those of you who, in the face of the suffering that we're experiencing on a lot of different levels, national and communal and individual, if you thought that this would be a series that would give you answers to why all this is happening, I think that Job is much like most texts in the Bible where if you come to it hoping to get an answer, you're probably going to come away with 3 more questions for every answer you get. Job is definitely like that. So there are major unresolved issues with no clear answer, and that's what we want from this text, right? And so a lot of times people will try and shoehorn Job into giving a really clear answer on why there is suffering and why do bad things happen to good people, and is there a reward for faithfulness and doing right in the world, and is there punishment for sin and doing wrong in the world? Is God just? That question, is God just? The theological shorthand for that is the question of theodicy. Is God just? Will God do what's right? And so while there are a lot of tensions and no clear answer, no clear positive answer to the question of why is there suffering, there is one thing that is clearly rejected, and that is the idea that there's a simple one-to-one correlation between doing good and being blessed by God, or conversely, doing evil and having bad things befall you. Job may have a lot of things that it's not prepared to give an answer about, but one thing that the book of Job will do is it will flat out reject that correlation. And this is a really interesting perspective, not just historically, not just theologically, but even within, for example, the arrangement of the books in the Old Testament. In our Christian arrangement of the Old Testament books, the Hebrew Bible, which is read by Jews, arranges the books of the Old Testament differently. But in our canonical ordering of the Old Testament texts, you have Job, and then Psalms, and then Proverbs. And what's fascinating is that so many of the Psalms deal with this very question, right? It's the psalmist crying out to the Lord. Why are these terrible things happening? I am in such terrible affliction, and I cry out to you, Lord, and why do you not hear me? And in some of the Psalms, you have the psalmist saying things that sound a lot like Job. I have washed my hands in righteousness, and yet my enemies rise against me. And so you have a number of these psalms where the psalmist, like Job, as we're going to see, the psalmist will assert his innocence and the unjustness of all the things that are befalling him. And so really calling into question that correlation, that idea that God is somehow a cosmic vending machine, and that if I put in enough obedience and enough faithfulness, that God is somehow obliged to bless me. The psalmist, in some of the Psalms, rejects that. And we're going to look at some of those Psalms in the Thursday Bible study for those of you who are interested in participating in that. But so you have the Psalms here, and some of them kind of lean toward Job on this question. Some of them, however, lean very much toward Proverbs. And Proverbs is really the quintessential, what's called wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Also sometimes called sapiential, which is just taking from the Latin root. But this wisdom literature, which on the one hand has a lot of good advice, right? If you keep doing bad things, you shouldn't expect your life to go well. Bad choices often lead to bad consequences. I think everyone can recognize and agree with that. But oftentimes in Proverbs, the dominant idea is that God is just, God will repay faithfulness, righteousness, and obedience with blessing, and will requite evildoers and sinners and all those who are unjust with bad things. And so many of these Proverbs are essentially warnings. And so you have Psalms in the middle, which sometimes tends one way, sometimes tends the other, and then Job and Proverbs. And Proverbs is the bullhorn for this idea that God will be just and will reward in this life obedience and faithfulness with blessing, and will in fact punish wrongdoing in this life. Job is going to take that on head on. Job, the book of Job, finds that perspective to be utterly inadequate for the actual human experience of suffering. That perspective that God will in this life always make sure that justice is done and the good and faithful people are blessed and the wicked and unjust people are punished. Almost none of us would assert that. And Job comes with guns blazing to take that on and say, our experience of suffering on a non-generalized scale, our individual experiences of suffering are not like that, and they need to be taken account of. So one of the great Old Testament scholars of the 20th and now into the 21st century is Walter Brueggemann, and I'm going to read just a little bit from his introduction to Job from his introduction to the Old Testament. He says, while it is commonly said that the poem of Job deals with the problem of evil or the problem of theodicy, that is God just, it is important at the outset to recognize that the issues taken up here are not speculative or cerebral. It's not generalized or abstract, right, about suffering and evil, but are rooted in and driven by the immediate facts within narrative context of Job as a character. Not that we're saying that Job was an actual lived person, but the facts of Job's suffering. The issues concerning the most intense and immediate existential issues of faith, morality, and fidelity that grow out of Israel's older traditions of the Torah, as in the book of Deuteronomy, and wisdom, as in the book of Proverbs, but never lose sight of the emotional and physical toll of being human. And so in that center section, we see Job standing as this almost shaking his fist at heaven, saying, God, I have been faithful, and it is unfair that this is happening to me. Why is this happening? Well, Job's friends have a very simple answer. Well, Job, you must have screwed up. Come on, Job, just admit it. Admit your sin, repent, and then God can bless you again. And Job just says, you know, I haven't always been perfect. I've done bad things, but I have not been so sinful and unfaithful and intentionally flouting God's power and God's commandments. I have not done that in a way that would make me deserve what's happening to me. And so Job will continually say, yeah, no, I'm not claiming I've never done anything wrong. I'm saying if I've done something so wrong that I deserve this, God needs to show up and tell me what it is, because I can't even repent for it. I can't offer a sacrifice because I don't know what it is. As far as I know, I've done everything I thought I was supposed to. I've tried my best. I've done everything I knew to do to be a faithful servant of God. So if I'm in the wrong, somebody's got to show me. Brueggemann again says, Job's friends do not engage him, but simply reiterate the primary claims of Israel's covenantal and sapiential tradition that the world governed by God is morally reliable, wherein obedience yields prosperity and disobedience yields adversity. God is a cosmic vending machine. The impeccable logic of his friends leads inescapably to the conclusion that Job suffers and that his suffering can only be grounded in disobedience. But Job insists that he is entitled to know the charges of disobedience against him if that's the case. Thus, the dispute concerns the unbearable mismatch between lived reality and traditional explanations that proceed by their own logic without reference to lived reality. I think this is really key. Every tradition has lots of explanations and lots of things to say about why there's evil and suffering in the world. But the book of Job is about saying, that's not my experience. And any answer that you friends all are going to give me is going to have to take account of my experience. Brueggemann says, Job's integrity requires truth-telling about his own lived experience, even if that truth-telling clashes with settled traditional explanations that relieve God of responsibility, and it exposes such explanations as inadequate, if not fraudulent. In making the case of innocence for himself, Job moves to refute decisively the traditional assumption of his friends that suffering is rooted in guilt. Job's bold self-assertion is a denial of guilt and insistence on his right. And so in doing that, he calls into question their whole system of understanding why bad things happen. And he basically says that system doesn't work. And also now God's got to come and give me an answer, which God is not prone to do. He's not so inclined. One of the theorized catalysts for this very extensive and rich and multifaceted exploration of these questions. Many scholars think that, in fact, this arises within Israel's tradition because of their experience of exile. And many of you are probably aware that many of the prophets, the writings of the prophets, and then also big chunks of Deuteronomy, which Brueggemann just referenced, seem to make it very clear that there was a dominant idea in Israel that the reason Israel was conquered by the Babylonians and the temple was destroyed and the Jews were carried off into exile, the reason that happened was because they were disobedient. To make sense of what seems to be the failure of God to live up to God's promises in the covenant to protect and care for Israel and to establish them and never to disestablish them in the land, it seems like God has not lived up to God's covenant promises in that. And so Deuteronomy, and then, as I said, also the prophets come back and say, well, we know that God must be faithful to God's promises. Therefore, the answer must be that this was a contingent covenant, and God's obligation to provide those blessings was contingent on Israel's obedience. And when Israel was disobedient, God was no longer obliged to keep God's end of the covenant. And so Israel was sent into exile as both punishment and also discipline to help teach it to be more diligent in obeying God's commands. If Job, at least the center section of Job, is a response, it is a response that says that's an inadequate explanation of our exile and our suffering and the disestablishment of our country and our people and our loss of our way of life and our status as an independent nation. All those things, God needs to provide an answer for why that happened. And simply that we were disobedient is not adequate. So there may be, in fact, a lot more communal theological issues at stake in this text than simply personal. And I don't think that one overrides the other or cancels the other out. But there may be a mega question above the question of individual suffering, but the question of corporate, national, and communal suffering and the causes of that. So that's something to keep in mind and something that we will take a bit of a look at in our Bible study, where we'll look at some passages from Deuteronomy in the Bible study on Thursday. Just in closing, I want to read one more small chunk from Brueggemann. He says, at the outset of the 21st century, as things have become unglued on a large scale, the artistry of the book of Job invites faith to face the dangers of a connection to a creator God who is immense in glory, but who offers no easy comfort. Such a practice of faith, if honest, may anticipate comforts and settlements here and there. Mostly, however, life and faith in a disputatious mode. Do not shrink from truth-telling that offends friends who comfort and that defies the God who self-congratulates. So with that as sort of a theme, we will continue in 2 weeks by looking at the first 2 chapters of Job, the prose narrative folktale beginning, in which we see this heavenly council, and God brags about Job and says, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him in all the world." And the adversary, the accuser, the Hebrew word is the Satan, comes and says, "Yeah, well, Job only is faithful because you bless him. If you take those blessings away, he will curse you to your face." And God says, "You're on. Let's see it." That's a challenging scenario. So next time we do this, in 2 weeks, we will look at, does God make bets with Satan? And how does that influence where we think suffering and evil comes from in our lives? I'm happy to continue discussing this text and these ideas with you all, and I hope you have a blessed couple weeks and that we will see many of you in the Bible study on Thursday. God bless.